But we're really glad that you could join us for this webinar that's on the topic of mental health and well-being and how to use your results. And we really thought this would be a great stimulus for institutions that have these results. So that is our aim today, to help you make better use of the data you have. So I hope you brought some good questions. We didn't get a whole lot of questions in the registration prompt, so please let this be the space to generate them and ask us. All right. Well, if we're ready, why don't we begin by announcing first that today's session is being recorded. And with that prompt, make sure that we do hit the record button. And that we're really happy to have folks join us, not only as presenters who will introduce them as they talk, but also just to demonstrate who's here today. And then we will, again, I said, really want to have some interaction. So don't wait until the very end for this interaction. We're happy to take your questions as we go. So let me start by just welcoming again. I'm Jillian Kinsey, and I am helping deliver this webinar today on mental health and well-being. And thank you. I'm joined by our colleagues here, Kristen Pretty, who's one of our fabulous research analysts, and Allison Birchka-Lorenz, who is associate research scientist and also one of our analysts, and Alethea Russell, who is our NSSE Institute project associate. So we're going to share in the presentation today. And I should acknowledge Kevin Wenger, who's masquerading as Nessie and helping us with some of the chat and controls for today's meeting. So thank you all for joining us. And let's get started with those kind of introductions. Actually, we would like to know who's in the room. So if you wouldn't mind using the chat and saying, introducing yourself, saying hi. And one of the things we're interested in learning today, and perhaps can share this within among everybody here, is what made you choose the mental health and well-being topical module? Did you come at this, the choice of this module, with a particular interest or need in mind? Is there something that prompted it? So we'd love to see that in the chat, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Okay, it always takes the first one to unclog the chat block there. Excellent. Great. Oh, and we got some good long answers. Yeah, I like the choice of module. Yeah, needing more data from students. That's always a good answer. Great. Yeah, choosing this module to gauge student well-being, and then to really join it with other survey efforts. Oh, great. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm glad to see that folks are indicating their interest. Great. Thank you. Excellent. All right. Good. Keep going with this, because I do think that this is a useful way for us to get a better sense of the variety of reasons and motivations for electing a module. It's, a lot of these choices, we give you up to 10 choices for modules. So it's always a mystery sometimes why institutions elect certain ones above others. And I also think it helps us understand what's popular and what's needed in the field. So getting your sense of your purposes will also help us figure out what we should be offering and why. All right, great. All right, well, keep adding and introducing yourself in here, but we'll get underway with the topic at hand. As most of you know, and even by your comments here indicating your interest in this model or this module, mental health and well-being is a really a large, quite extensive interest in higher education today. And, I think it's only escalated in recent years. And, as I look at what institutions are saying about this and the importance of really trying to get at important barriers to help-seeking behaviors and how students view services and facilities, it really is intent on helping students find the resources that are available to them, and how do we help facilitate that for our students. And we've been trying to share a little bit more about what we've been learning from a variety of different surveys. And I'll just point to two stories that came out rather recently, both actually from our entering student survey, the beginning college survey of student engagement, BESE. So if you're not a participant in that, you may not be familiar with BESE, but recently BESE actually featured a story just a week ago where there's a blog site that is talking a little bit about what this means for mid-semester feedback and how we might want to start checking in with our students about their mental health and wellness, given some of the results we're seeing from the beginning college survey of student engagement. So Jim Cole did a pretty nice story with some graphical representation of where entering students are. And we did some of this also the year prior when we were trying to examine how are students coming back into institutions after being in very different high school environments and then coming into college and what that meant. So these might be two things to check out, but there's certainly a lot of goings on right now and a lot of writing and coverage on this important topic. So I'm sure there's no shortage of ideas and concepts on this topic right now. So I'm going to let Kristen introduce a little bit about how we got to this module.
Yes, so as Jillian discussed before, we talked about how mental health and continues to be a major concern, and a lot of you all in the chat have talked about how it continues to be a big concern as well on your campuses. And so we figured it was really a good moment to capture some information about mental health and well-being. So the origin story of this module is it started out as an experimental set. And for those who are not familiar with experimental sets, every year our team kind of chooses some topics to cover to kind of dive deeper. And so this really came out of a need to assess COVID-19's impact on mental health, because there was a lot of narratives and stories discussing how COVID-19 and the implications and impact of that have affected, students and people's well-being generally. And so a lot of items kind of merged from the COVID-19 module that we had, but really just, again, trying to understand how mental health and well-being are kind of being understood overall across institutions. And so this is really influenced and supported by Butler University, their Student Well-being Institutional Support Survey, also known as SWIS. And so we used a lot of that information and intel to understand how we can better craft a module that fit, again, this understanding of mental well-being or mental health, but also this idea of physical well-being as well. And so just a brief kind of content overview of the module and kind of some impetus for what each question really meant. For question one, and that one also kind of built out of the COVID-19 module, but really wanted to understand what areas of difficulty were being experienced by students. And so in the past, it was, again, based off COVID-19, but now we recognize that those areas are difficulty, regardless of where COVID-19 is happening or not. And so looking at those areas of difficulty and getting an expansive list of what areas people may be struggling with. And then we had question two, which talks about varying entities of support for mental health. And so just have a snapshot of that as a picture. And so really wanted to understand who was supporting mental health and well-being, whether it's kind of more personal relationships or more institutional relationships, and really wanted to dig in there because that could be opportunities to see where support is needed, both kind of helping people get support personally, but also institutionally, how can we provide more support for mental health? And then question three was talking about access to resources and physical well-being as well. We had a lot of conversation about this on whether or not this should be focused on just mental health, but we recognize that physical well-being, that overall kind of understanding just how to be a healthy or mentally fit person impacts your mental health as well. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured some of that, and also understanding what resources people have access to in order to kind of tackle some of these areas. And then for the second half of the item set, we have question four, which is looking at institutional support for mental health and well-being. So kind of the same thing as question three, but really digging into what institutions are doing for their students regarding mental health. We have question five, which talks about accessibility to adequate resources from institutions. And so we have the snapshot here as well. And so we want to see, different access and accessibility requirements that students need that their institution is providing. So like, for example, dining options that meet your dietary needs. Oftentimes when we don't think about well-being, we may not think about food and kind of nourishing your bodies. And so we're learning to get in these kind of different aspects of well-being that students often are talking about, having issues with, and want to address those and actually measure those. And then lastly, we have our question six, which was an open-ended question on institutional support for mental health. And so our wonderful Alethea will cover that later on in the presentation, but she'll talk a little bit more about how we can explore the open-ended responses through some sort of qualitative analysis, but that can also give really, really good insight into what students are experiencing and then being able to narrate that information as well. So wanted to remind you all about your topical module report, but also your data files. And so overall, we have the NSSE 2023 data in both the SPSS version and then Excel version, but you also have your student comments, which are in Excel and SPSS versions as well. And so take a dive and deep and explore. The screenshot on the left really captures Nesseville State, which is our example institution, but really the information that you can get from the report for the mental health and well-being module. But also really think about your comparison group. So it's good to see a lot of you all in the chat have talked about wanting to compare to kind of national averages and stuff. And so I think that's really important to be able to understand that all of our institutions have very different resources for mental health, very different access to financial sources for mental health, and very different students who have very different lived experiences. And so comparisons can be really, really helpful to kind of capture what's happening in your institution versus other ones. But I'd also encourage you to look within, right? So within institutions, we have, very different students who are having very different lived experiences, and there may be a general sense of similarity, but again, individuals have, tackling a lot of things, especially in this day and age. And so also looking at those comparisons, but making sure you're looking within. And I think some of the insight that we'll see next from Allison and Alethea will give you some insight onto how to look within and some of those information. So with that, I'll pass it to Allison.
Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to outline 5 examples of different strategies you could use to look at your data and results. These aren't the only ways, obviously, that you can look at this, and they're not the correct ways to look at it, but just some ways to give you some ideas, but also allow you to see some of our results and things that we're looking at and finding interesting in the data. So the first use strategy that I have is disaggregation with ranking. So ranking priorities and things like that is important, and we'll talk about that again, but it's important, as Kristen started talking about, to be looking within and to disaggregate, because different students are going to have different experiences. So we have an example here where we've looked at who is most supportive mental health and well-being, and I will note I excluded friends, family, and significant others because they topped everybody's list, which is great to see, but difficult for an institution to do something about. So excluding them, who were the most supportive people? And you see here we have instructors across the board, which I think is very important for people to look at and think about, because instructors don't necessarily know how to support students in their mental health and well-being. And there's a lot in the news about that right now. So if instructors are popping up towards the top of your list, make sure that they have access to what they need to do this well, because students will be turning to them when they need help. Other things I think that this helped us see is counseling services pops out for certain types of students. And what we know from students' experiences with the counseling centers is they're often grateful to have access to those resources, but they don't often cater to the specific kind of identities or needs of students in a lot of different ways. So knowing what types of students are needing the counseling centers assistance can be useful. And then I just wanted to give a shout out to some other people who we know are very helpful for students in different contexts. So making sure academic advisors have access to resources, and those cultural identity centers that we have on campus, making sure they know how to help students to get help. So this is just a quick way to see how different types of students are using support and resources at your institution. A second kind of strategy is to focus on the negative. Now, I wouldn't generally live your life from this orientation, but it can be quite helpful when you're looking at your data to focus on the negative. So what I have here are the proportions of people not getting access to the resources they need. So very little or not at all feeling their institution has provided them adequate resources, or students that disagree that they have access to these different things. So these are people who are telling us they don't have what they need for their wellness. And so this is a good place to start if you're looking for things to get started on. And my next question is always, well, who are these students? Who are the people not getting the access or support that they need? Is there some sort of trend that you're you can find that underlies this, that you can get these students the help that they need. And then just sort of an interesting thing, I thought, that's a very large proportion of students struggling with affordable housing, which I don't know that this is always on schools' to-do lists. So keep track of that one. And also satisfied with the amount of exercise. I'm surprised that's not higher, because same people, but just knowing that students are struggling, doing what they need to do in situations that we might be placing that kind of expectation on them to figure out how to do it on their own. So my next strategy is a little combo of both of those previous ones. We're going to focus on some negatives, but we're also going to do some ranking so that we can kind of prioritize what we want to tackle first. So I did divide this by first years and seniors, thinking maybe there's a difference in them knowing where to get help or not. So these are the percentages of students that do not know where to get help for these different situations. And there is a little bit of shuffling of the ones that are at the top, but not a lot. Largely, the rank ordering of these is the same. So maybe the rank ordering and splitting didn't matter, but I did notice that the percentages for seniors were notably higher. And my first thought was, well, that's strange. These students have been around for a while, right? They should know where to get access to these resources. So what is going on here? Well, that kind of brings me to the next strategy, digging in a little bit. So I thought, what differentiates seniors? They probably are living off campus. So I changed my strategy a bit, and I shifted to look at first year students and senior students who are living on campus. And if they're on campus, these percentages of not knowing where to get help go down. They go down quite notably for seniors, so much so that I gave it this flashy pulsing animation just to really show off how much lower it is. And so what I learned from this is, if you have some sort of mystery, keep digging. That's a strategy. But also, this is a message for how can we get information to students who aren't living or super close to us all the time. That is a good lesson and a thing to think about, but this still would leave a lot of students on campus that don't know how to get help. So lots of different angles to attack this, but these results would suggest to me one good place to start is finding a way to communicate well with people who don't live on campus. Okay, my final strategy, I saved it toward the end because it's my favorite. So I call it creating baskets, but this would more technically be called a person-centered approach to data analysis. And what you do in those sorts of approaches is you don't divide people based on their demographics. You instead divide them into categories based on their experience. So I did want to look at first generation and continuing generation students and how difficult things have been for those different groups, but I didn't start there. I didn't just start and divide the group by that identity. Instead, I took all the students and I divided them into a high amount of difficulty on these 3 difficulties, a moderate amount of difficulty, and a low amount of difficulty. Now, luckily for me, there are 6 response options for this, so it was pretty easy to group those students into high, medium, or low. But there are different strategies. You could do quartiles or terciles or something like that in different kind of circumstances. But what I did now is so that I can see that not all first gen students are going to fall into one of these categories, and not all the first or the continuing gen students are going to fall into one of these categories. But you'll see the percentage of first gen in blue and continuing generation in the magenta. And just for the sake of simplicity here, I'm going to focus on these high percentages. So what you're seeing here is about the same proportion of first generation and continuing generation students are in this high difficulty basket for mental and emotional exhaustion, which I feel deeply. Similarly, academics, there's a similar proportion in that high basket, but where you really see a difference is in the finances, which I think some of us might have expected. There's a larger proportion of first gen students in this high difficulty of finances than continuing. But the reason I like taking this person-centered approach is that you can see there are still a third of your continuing generation students here that are struggling with finances. So putting people into categories based on their demographic might not be the best way to help students having difficulties. So just trying to look at it from different angles to make sure you're not skipping people because they don't fit into their demographic checkbox the way that other students do would be my lesson here. And we do have other resources for person-centered analyses if you're interested in more details on that. But now I'm going to hand over to Alethea to talk about our qualitative information.
Allison, before we do that, I wanted
Sure.
to make sure that we paused
Oh,
since
yeah.
you covered a lot of
I did.
excellent ideas here. If anybody had any questions about any of these data strategies, does any of this sound like something that you've already attempted?
Yeah, or do you have other ideas that we could add to our strategy list?
All right, I see Rachel has a hand up. Rachel, would you, or is it Rochelle? I'm sorry.
Rachel, I have a question, not necessarily about the strategies specifically, but about these questions. I had shared the data with my colleague in student affairs, and she was curious about our results for the counseling center. So for question 2, it almost seems like the results in her estimation don't really fully align with the results in question 5 about counseling services being adequate, and also just in terms of the qualitative data, there are a lot of great comments about the counseling services. So I was just wondering if we're interpreting question 2. I guess that does kind of go to Allison's point about the data, like excluding those personal connections like family. But I guess I'm just looking for a little bit of feedback on how to really interpret question 2, if that makes sense. Sorry, that was kind of a roundabout way of asking it, but I wanted to provide the context as well.
Actually, maybe Elise is going to get here, so I'm not going to say much, but I think some of our qualitative information speaks a little bit to that. My suspicion is it has to do, and I very briefly said something about this, between having access, but it being helpful for you. We see a lot of things like, oh yeah, I have access to the health center, but they don't know about non-binary gender identities, so I can get there, but it's not really giving me what I needed. So it could be that. I mean, it's a little hard to say, but I think access and actual successful support are very different for students, at least what we've seen in the work that we've done with it.
But I like your question, Rachel, because I think it suggests the potential for examining counseling services as a topic across the questions. So there might be reflections on the variety of either by student identity groups, how student identity groups view the extent to which counseling services supported them. Allison's kind of data strategy 1. And then I think the other approach would be question 5, which asks about the adequacy of resources. And to me, first, it is a very different question. Right. And you could do the same thing to see if the perceptions of institutional emphasis are different and if they sort in the same way. But you could also just tell the story about counseling services, the support, and then versus the adequate resources. So I think those are 2 very different points about counseling services.
Thank you.
I will add, because we talked about this in our annual results, and I wanted to make sure I was accurate, but across the board, counseling services was pretty low in terms of support. So you're not seeing something that isn't happening at a lot of other institutions that have taken the module as well. So that may be something, again, with Alethea and kind of the open-ended comments, I think you're seeing some difference there. But across the board, it may be a perception of whether it's supported or adequately resourced or access. We didn't really differentiate that in the question, which may be an iteration to consider in the future.
Right. Any other questions that folks had? Thank you, Rachel, for asking that. All right, this is not your only chance to ask questions, but we'll move to Alethea now to talk a little bit about the qualitative.
All right, thanks guys. This is a great segue. So myself and another graduate assistant here for NSSE, we were able to do thematic analysis on the open-ended prompt. And just as a refresher, this is the open-ended prompt. We basically asked what is one way the institution supported their mental health and well-being and gave them opportunity to describe. So in terms of our team, it was a team of 2 of us, and we had a very big population since we looked at all the responses. It was over 13,000 responses. And we used in vivo, and we did a thematic analysis process called codebook thematic analysis. It's basically just like a slightly more efficient way of being able to split up large data sets like this. So if you do have a really large data set of open-ended responses for your institution, don't let the number freeze you into not looking at the responses. There is a way to split those up kind of a bit more reliably. And the citation for that is at the bottom of the slide if you need the resource to be able to do that. But in doing so, we were able to split this 13,000 responses up to look for basically themes across the board. And we found primarily 3 themes. So the major things that we found were students identified promotion, awareness, and outreach initiatives as one way their institution supported their mental health and well-being. So you can think about these as your email campaigns, whether it's any actual event or things like that that might either destigmatize conversations around mental health, or it might be classroom conversations, it might be campus AI tech systems, those types of things. The other thing that really stood out, Allison alluded to this a little bit earlier, the faculty interactions. Faculty interactions were a huge part of what students were identifying as supporting their mental health. And I want to also preface these things with the caveat that we might have asked a positive leaning question, but that does not mean that they gave us positive leaning responses. And the way that they were particularly describing faculty interactions, it could either swing 1 or 2 ways. It was either really supportive faculty or really negatively impacting their mental health and well-being practices. And then the last thing they talked about was resource engagement. And we pretty much categorized these as any time a student mentioned a very tangible resource that the institution provided. So the big 3 were counseling services, events, and student health and wellness services. So to that point, of these listed, counseling services was the only thing that we had to code significantly for positive and negative tone in terms of people saying, well, I recognize that my institution offers this, but my counseling services experience has been terrible, or my friend went to counseling services and they didn't help, or perhaps the wait time to get an appointment is too long. And so those are some of the major things that really stood out in the qualitative piece. Looking at these in terms of applicability, we find that if you look at the open-ended responses, looking at promotion, awareness, and outreach, this is a really practical way to determine what types of outreach you're doing might be the most or least effective. So for example, students sometimes might have said something along the lines of, my institution emails me about mental health and wellness, but they are the problem. Or it's a blanket email that doesn't really feel meaningful. And then in terms of faculty interactions, to echo Allison's point again, faculty showed up really heavily as the place that students go to for support with their mental health and well-being, but they may or may not be qualified or trained to be able to provide that type of support. And so one practical way that we can remedy that is find ways that we can collaborate with faculty for mental health and well-being support, and also supporting faculty and their mental health and well-being support in general, because healthy people help make other healthy people. And then with the resource engagement, you get direct feedback about your university resources. What are they doing well? What are they not doing well? Even if the question seemingly didn't even ask them about it, I feel like students are, students, and they're going to tell us if they get an open box and they're in the mood, they're going to tell us what they're feeling in that moment. So there's a great rich opportunity to get some direct feedback about university resources, even if you didn't expect to get that feedback in this particular platform.
Excellent. Thank you, Alethea. Any questions about the qualitative? Who's got a great idea or approach to analyzing the qualitative results? Anybody dug into those and noticed any of the same things that Alethea mentioned about sentiment and positive and negative on counseling? Those might be things to look for if you haven't dug into those results. Right, I'm very good at giving wait time. But again, okay, we're moving along. Okay, right. I'm going to move to the next section. This is our last little bit here where I'm just going to try and synthesize a few ideas. And then, all right, so I did ask a couple people if they would be willing to share what they're already thinking about. So we'll do that right at the right after I finish my second slide. But I want to try and stimulate some of your thinking about how to make use of these results. You know, I always want to appreciate every bit of feedback and information students provide to us via surveys or any other mechanism we use. But I think the ones in this case that we're asking about mental health and well-being are particularly sensitive for us to make use of these data. So, you know, I think it's it's always incumbent on us to make use, but particularly for these data. So I want to encourage you in a couple of ways to think about this work. First is, you know, always going back to your purpose. Many of you indicated your purpose was to get information from students and to learn more about their well-being. And I think, you know, going back to that and saying, okay, because that was our purpose, we really need to make sure that we're taking advantage of these results. The other thing is going back to who cares about this information. That's always a good place to start when you're trying to stimulate results use. And if that is counseling center based, as several of you indicated in your comments, health and wellness center interest, going to those folks to help you think about what these results might mean for your campus is a good start. And that certainly relates to what the second bullet indicates about sharing results. And, you know, who should be interested in these data is another way to frame it. And I think both Allison and Alethea's comments today really reminded me about how instructors might be an audience for this work. But doing that in a pretty careful, thoughtful way so that there's not a fear that you're striking with instructors that they're not able to handle the attention that they're getting in terms of helping students address their mental health. So pairing results with some support resources might be a way to share some of these results. The other thing that I think is always a strategy for stimulating result use is by really spending some time thinking about relevance and finding where the results will have relevance. And if there are campus conversations about addressing mental health, or in the case that Allison raised about differentiating services and the perception of services for on-campus students and off-campus students, particularly noting, you know, if there's an off-campus or commuting campus unit on your campus, they might be really interested in that. So they could focus some of their activities on resources or supports that students who are not living on campus might need attention in terms of promoting. So I think that idea of finding where units or groups on campus might have this interest is really important. So in the last slide, I'm just going to go through a couple of ideas just to stimulate your thinking. And sorry for the busyness. I thought I had these as animation coming in one at a time, but I must have missed that step. But let me do the first one. And this is really complementary to what Allison described as data strategies. And here what I'm doing is just simplifying it a little bit to think about each of these as a discrete sort of report. So one of the ideas of reporting a difficulty inventory. So identifying where your students have identified or what topics your students identify as having the most difficulty with. And then, as Allison suggested, perhaps sorting these by salient student identity groups. I think that might be a very concise report just on the difficulties that students are encountering, and then by student identity groups that make it a little bit more meaningful and perhaps be more open to suggesting programming opportunities. The second topic that I thought was interesting is, again, just based on question 2 and the supports first that students identify as being important to them. And I think that just descriptive results, percentages of students indicating these supports is one way, but pairing that with some qualitative comments that illustrate where students are finding that support, or an example of who provided that support in students' own words, would make for a really nice report. And inviting maybe counseling centers or faculty to talk about how they are a support, or how they made themselves supportive to students, might be a really nice, concise kind of positive looking support analysis report that could be offered. And then the third one I just labeled resource awareness. And this gets a little bit more at maybe the negative too, where students might identify problem areas where they don't have any knowledge of something. And that might, again, suggest where action might be taken. And you could concentrate your resource awareness report either on things that are highest for very little or not at all knowledge, or I don't know anything about this. And that might be where particular units might want to know, oh boy, we're on the I don't know anything about that list. So thinking about how that might help spur some action, or at least some interpretation of what that means. So these are just a couple of ideas that bridge, I think, Allison's great data strategy and Alethea's fine representation of what the qualitative data might reveal, and how to batch these in a little bit more consumable reports. So I'm going to stop there and go to our last slide, where we actually are inviting you. And again, I did ask a couple of people who I had hoped might be doing something. And I'm going to just perhaps see, I'm going to call on one and then hope that maybe the other two chime in. But I wonder if Kayla, my friend from Mississippi State, might be willing to just offer a little verbal, a little statement about kind of what you've been up to at Mississippi State on this regard.
Hey everybody, I'm actually on with one of my colleagues, Sandy Ezel, and we are starting a new task force, and it meets for the first time on Monday. It's about student well-being, and the first thing on the agenda is for me to share our NSSE results. I actually just made sure I sent them to Sandy a few minutes ago to show her, you know, we've got several places that we are statistically positive and negative compared to some of our peers. So that is our starting point to really take a campus-wide look and focus on what is our data showing and what do we need to do to improve it, our student experience here.
Yeah, so Kayla, one of the things I hear is you're really emphasizing the mean scores and where there's a statistically significant difference to the comparison institutions, just to kind of say, all right, is this a strength maybe in our current context, or is it something that we should be concerned about given the fact that we're performing, or our students view this less than other students at other institutions?
Absolutely. And we're also, Sandy asked to make sure that I also share the qualitative piece, because there's been a lot of, our students had a lot of powerful things to say that was, it is represented in the quantitative data. It's just not in the same ways. So we'll be sharing that piece as well, just to capture that student voice.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Yeah, excellent. All right. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in. I'm going to say Gary.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Gary Coyne. I'm a data analyst in student affairs at Cal State Long Beach. And we're about 2 years into sort of a student affairs wide initiative to support our students' mental health. So really interested in gathering data to get a sense of where these efforts might be starting to have an impact, where there might still be room to further refine our efforts. So I was really interested in looking at where students knew they could find resources and where students felt like they were being supported. And then I will say I've done a little bit of work just starting to disaggregate some of those answers by, some of the standard demographics you might think of, gender, major, first generation status. And I've gotten sort of just far enough down that road to realize, I've got all these demographic variables, all these responses, and that's just a ton of stuff to try to make sense of. So it's feeling maybe a little bit stuck and overwhelmed, but I thought that the suggestion earlier about ranking where students maybe feel the most support, where they maybe have the least knowledge, seemed like a really good way to kind of reduce the complexity, as well as potentially set up sort of what's the population? That's your subject. What are they struggling with, or who do they turn to for support? And that's your object. And what is the issue is the verb, right? So our first gen students struggle with food insecurity and are most likely to go to an instructor for support. So that could potentially set up some pretty straightforward ways to start making connections with just different units or folks on campus to support our students.
Oh, I love the fill in the blank part of your model there. That is really, very creative. But I think a nice illustration of some ways to honor students' populations on your campus and also to represent the range. Yeah, nice. I don't know. Anybody else have a comment, or either panelists or other folks, or a question for what Gary or Kayla just shared? Other thoughts, Diane? Might you?
I'm happy to share.
Thanks. Thank you.
So I'm at Meredith College, the Director of Research Planning and Assessment, and it's a women's college. And we have been looking at issues of mental health for some years now. Probably back in 2018, we started to hear from colleagues about an uptick in students experiencing anxiety, and also our counseling center having higher rates of students seeking out their assistance. And we've had for the last 10 years or so an in-house student satisfaction survey, which includes some questions around campus climate. And we added to that a question about students experiencing anxiety. And at that point, it was just a, rate your, on a 6-point scale, your level of agreement. And we started to see an increase in level of anxiety. And so in the last 2 years, where students either agree or strongly agree they're experiencing anxiety, we've added in a question that asks them to elaborate. And we've partnered with our psychology department and some of their students to help us do the qualitative analysis of that data. And that's been really, really, really insightful and helpful. So, she goes through with her students and analyzes that and then presents back to us. And us being the Council for Institutional Effectiveness, who is our primary group that we present all of our data to, helps us to disseminate it to the constituents of that group, which includes Dean of Students, the Counseling Center. We have a Student Success Center, Health Services. Maybe there's also some other units that we include, but we try to disseminate that data as widely as possible. And so the NSSE was really added on this year because we do it every 3 years, NSSE. We added on the mental health and wellness module, in order to gather some comparative data. And so that's really interesting for us to see where we are similar to other institutions, where we are really very different to other institutions. So for instance, our first year students really are showing much higher levels of saying that they need significantly high levels of mental health crisis and mental health generally, saying that they're, needing assistance. The good news is that we have significantly higher rates of students saying that they know where to go in order to get the support. So we're just gathering information, and this Friday we have a Council for Institutional Effectiveness meeting, and we'll be starting discussion around both sets of data. Our in-house reports that have been generated, the qualitative reports, together with the NSSE data. So trying to get a picture of how we're doing and where we can do better to support students.
Nice, nice. Oh, I love the layered comparative work that you've just described. That's really helpful. And I think, Dan, one of the questions that we had coming into this session that we were chatting about, Kristen and Allison and Alethea and I, about the comparative value. And you've just really emphasized that as being a way for you to really either stimulate some more people's interest around a topic, or perhaps to normalize and say, you know, our students aren't any different, or where your students really, this is a notable challenge for our students because it is so much more so than at other places. And then, of course, the counter to that you've already indicated. So, it's a nice way to take advantage of the comparative results, I think, to both normalize and then really to emphasize what might deserve more attention on your campus. That's great.
I like the idea of passing it out a little bit more. We are a women's only institution, so gender is obviously a factor of just being a women's institution, but by some of those other variables, and seeing that you have that data in that data set is helpful, that we can dig down a little deeper.
Yes. Yeah. So because we've expanded the student identity items too, it does allow you to dig a little deeper into that. And I think that would be really useful for all of your context. And of course, a reminder is not only, you certainly have all of the variables that are in our data file, but because you have student level identified information, you can add your own information to this. So if grades or other student information system data are if they're important to relate to this topic, that might be worth adding to your data file, or importing this into your other student information system. So you can also include grades or retention status or any other things that might seem relevant. Okay. All right, anybody else get a wild hair idea while we were talking, or something you want to pursue? Well, no shortage of ideas here. I won't make anyone do a public commitment to pursue one of these, but we will make the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint slides and the webinar will be available after this. So it'll take a little bit to render and we'll post it. And both of those things will be available on our website on the same webinar page where we keep all of our recorded sessions. And so if you want to return to any of this to be reminded of the really smart things that everybody shared here today, that would be great. And we are planning to do a little bit more on this topic. So today, this webinar was exclusively for schools with these results. So we wanted to be able to talk about how to unpack your own results. And what we're going to follow up with is a more general webinar and presentation on mental health findings overall. And we're probably going to do that in conjunction with the group that Kristen mentioned at the beginning, another group that has also looking at mental health issues. We think there's so much interest on this topic that it's worth kind of combining our findings to offer some insights for the field. And then we're probably going to do an annual results story on this topic, given its prominence in the field. So we hope to roll out a few other resources for you just to get a greater national picture on this topic as well. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you too about either things that worked, reports you developed, Diane, if you want to share how your Council for Institutional Effectiveness goes, or Kayla, if you want to share how your meeting goes on Monday or next week, that would be great. We'd love to hear more about that. But and ask us questions, please. You've got 4 resources identified here today, being people. So Allison, Kristen, Alethea, or myself, we're happy to help you with any of this. So please be in touch with us. So we're happy to stay on for a few more moments and answer any questions or final thoughts. Excellent. We want to thank you for thinking about this with us, and I hope it helps stimulate some ideas on your part. Any, Allison or Kristen or Alethea, any final words before we sign off?
I will somewhat selfishly say that we've focused a lot on student wellness and well-being, but don't forget about your staff and faculty. I do a lot of work with faculty wellness, and it's very difficult for people, as Alethea said, who are unwell to help those who are unwell. So don't forget about everyone else on campus.
Yeah, and please reach out, and we're available for any questions. So we'll just kind of hang for a couple minutes here, but if you are satisfied and are ready to head to the rest of your day, please take the time, take the 5 minutes to get a drink of water and walk around maybe. This is about well-being, so take a stretch. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Gary and Kayla and Diane, for being called upon or being willing to be called upon. And thanks, Rachel and others who offered some comments. We really appreciate it.